Hello, I'm Katie Kelaidis, the resident scholar at the National Hellenic Museum, and you're about to watch my conversation with Dr. Ted Zervas of North Park University. A true Chicago boy born into the city to Greek immigrant parents, Dr. Zervas has a BA in History and Political Science from DePaul University and a master's degree in History from DePaul. He also has a master's degree in Education and Social Policy from Northwestern University and a Ph.D. in Cultural and Educational Policy Studies from Loyola University Chicago. Dr. Zervas' most recent book, The Making of Modern Greek Identity, Education, Nationalism, and the Teaching of a Greek National Past, is a must-read for anyone interested in the roles the Greek schools played in shaping Greek national identity. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Thank you so much. Welcome, Professor Zervas. I really appreciate you agreeing to do this with us.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a local Chicagoan, so it's always nice to connect with the Hellenic Museum here in Chicago.
I saw that you have touched you've made the rounds of Chicago's higher education institutions as well.
Yeah, I guess that's part of what happens when you grow up in a Greek family. They don't want you to go too far from home, so you're kind of stuck nearby, right?
Yeah, no,
But
but you've collected them all, so we really
yeah,
appreciate you coming. And I'm really interested. When I sort of found your work, I was really interested to have you come talk to us because I think this question of education and national identity is a question that's become very pertinent in the American context as well. And I think this is a really interesting opportunity sort of to talk about those sort of bigger issues, how that's played out in the Greek context, in the Greek American context, and maybe we can talk about Greek school too, and we can
sure.
all exercise our demons from Greek school as
Yeah,
well.
and that's something that I get a question all the time from those of us that grew up in the Greek school, whether it was here in, the United States or Canada or somewhere else in the world, in Europe or South Africa or Australia. A lot of it, the questions are, what are some of these sort of misconceptions that we learned in the Greek school? And what is really the truth about what happened during Ottoman times, right? Is it really true that we were slaves under the Turks for 400 years, right? So I get that question all the time. And I've been thinking about this because we do have the 200th anniversary of the Greek Revolution. And there's a famous book, Lies My Teacher Told Me here in the United States, about lies that American students learned. And that could easily be applied to the Greek school too. Lies my Greek school teacher told me. Um, Not so much maybe lies in the Greek school, but more of sort of spin, I guess you could sort of put it. A lot of spin going on in what we learned in the Greek school. But it's an interesting topic about the Greek school because the Greek school really symbolizes in Greece and in the diaspora of the Greek community, it symbolizes survival. And really that's really how you could sum it up and sort of what it means for a lot of Greeks, that it is a school, and many Greeks do believe this, right? And there are arguments about it, to what extent the school play in maintaining a sort of Greek identity, but there is a sense of sort of survival, and that's what the Greek school represents, and it symbolizes much more maybe now here in the diaspora in the United States because we are an ethnic community, a minority in the United States, and we cling more to the sort of the school and the church because we feel threatened by external forces, right? These external assimilation forces that might happen, that we might end up becoming assimilated. In the United States, of course, the Greeks are the ones that, one of the few minorities that really resist this sort of assimilation where other ethnic groups sort of maintain. And I think this dates back to sort of our experience during Ottoman times, right? When we felt like we were trying to be assimilated, trying to maintain our sort of national identity. So let me go into sort of a little bit of history here because I think it
Yeah.
is important with the context of what's going on here. And let me just go a little bit back to what the Greek school looked like during Ottoman times, right? Or
Let's start there. Perfect.
Ottoman colonial rule. So from 1453 to about 1821, this 400 years since the fall of Constantinople or the conquest of Constantinople, depending on who you're talking to, what this Greek school looked like. And really, most communities did have some sort of Greek school. They operated Greek school. And by the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire consolidated many of its political and social institutions in the Balkans, and then it granted the minority groups a substantial degree of self-rule, right? And this is the sort of thing that we learned in Greek school, that we were under slaves under the Turks for 400 years, when in fact, what the Greek community, Greek Orthodox community within the Ottoman looked like was, it was a sort of a country within a sort of empire, right? So religious groups like Muslims, Greek Orthodox, Jewish, and Armenian Christians were organized around the system called millets, or nations. And the millet system worked well for both the communities and the Sultan, right? They were giving a certain degree of freedom, and the church was responsible for, running the millet, collecting taxes for the Sultan, maintaining order within the millet, and administering the Sultan's laws and operating the schools. As long as the millet sort of didn't cause any trouble, we were okay. The Sultan was okay with it. If he got his money from the taxes, they were okay with it. They didn't bother the particular millets, right? We also have to remember that the Ottoman Empire is a sort of multi-ethnic empire, right?
Yes.
There's different religions, different languages being spoken. Even within the hierarchy of the Ottoman Empire, the Dragoman, the Grand Viziers, a lot of them are going to be, the Grand Vizier is really the prime minister, and in some ways running the show. A lot of them are going to be ethnic Greeks who later convert to Islam, become Muslim, and Serbs, Albanians, and so forth. And then we also have to remember, depending on where you were, Greek education varied considerably. So if we're looking at, I don't know, big cities or cosmopolitan centers like Constantinople or Istanbul, then you're going to have a more robust sort of Greek education. That's true for like Alexandria. It's also true for Smyrna, Jassy up in Romania today, Venice. And Greek schools in these cities were better organized and better resourced. Let's say the provincial schools in Greece, in the rural communities. And in these schools in the rural communities, they're probably no different than, let's say, like what a Sunday school was. And in these schools, priests conducted the lessons, and it was basically reading and writing, as well as the general tenets of the Greek Orthodox faith. And it was really like catechism, right? So kids read from the Bible, kids learned stories from the Bible, right?
Yeah.
And kids learn how to read and write, basic reading and writing in Greek, right? And really the idea is like, if you're a farmer, right, and your parents are farmers, what's the point of having a sort of, extensive education, right, if you're not really going to be anything but a farmer, right? So that's really what the goal was. It was sort of minimum. And even if we talk to our Greek grandmothers who grew up in Greece, like my grandmother, I remember her talking about when she was in Greece, she only had a third grade education, but that was the expectation, right? You weren't expected to sort of go on to high school or university, and you were going to be a farmer, and that's what you were going to do for the rest of your life.
Can I ask a kind of parallel question that I think is, was there some sort of other, for lack of a better word, I know this does, secular or sort of Ottoman education system running alongside the Greek schools, or is the Greek school sort of the primary education?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So the Greek schools are sort of put at the highest standard of schooling, especially the ones, and I'm not talking about the provincial schools and let's say the Peloponnese, right? These sort of Sunday schools. I'm talking about the Greek schools in the major metropolitan area, like Thessaloniki, or like in Constantinople, or like in Smyrna or in Izmir. Those are seen even by Ottoman standards, Turkish standards, right, as being better funded, better resourced than the Turkish schools. There is a complaint, and this goes back even further down in their historical record, during the Abdul Hamid administration, which is sort of the last sort of attempt by the Ottoman Empire to sort of maintain its power at the turn of the 20th century, where they go and evaluate the Turkish schools, and you hear some of the observers at the time saying, "Oh my God, these Greek schools are better than our schools, right? Why can't we have schools like these Greeks, right?" And it's true even before that time that you have other ethnic groups, Romanians, for example, Albanians, for example. There's a Zosimia school in Ioannina, and many of the national heroes of Albania actually come out of that school, right? Which is a Greek school, right? And in some ways, a Greek school does serve in sort of assimilating these ethnic groups, making them Greek, for example, right? They're Christian, typically Christian, Orthodox Christian groups who their parents value a Greek education. They see these schools as having a valuable education. They feel that it's maintaining their Orthodox Christianity as well. And they send these kids to these schools, right? And they feel that that's how they will, and these obviously would be better to do families, for lack of a better term, that they send their kids to these schools. And yeah, so in a certain respect, these schools are better funded and a better resource than the Ottoman schools. So, and then of course you also have the religious education, the religious training schools, Kelaidis, in Constantinople and Istanbul, the training of priests as well, which is sort of goes back to Megali Scholi, for example, which is the training school, goes back to Byzantine times, right? It's still there during Ottoman times. So generally children between the ages of 6 and 12 would have attended these schools. And we have the story about the Krifo Scholio, right? And the song, Fegaraki Mula Bro, Fegemuna Perpato, Napigano Scholio. And it happens during the night. And we learned it in Greek school that, you know, they went to school at night because they're being persecuted. So they had to hide and sort of secretly go into these clandestine
schools. The caves, I was told.
Yeah, in the caves, right. In the caves to learn that, right?
Yeah.
When the reality
was. Lucky.
Yeah, when the reality was, for the most part, it wasn't that they were hiding it. It was just that they were working during the day, and at night they went to school, right? So little bright moon, Fegaraki Mulabro, lead me to go to school at night, right? They're going to school at night. And I don't want to sort of diminish the experience that there wasn't any sort of closing of schools. There is a closing of schools, and it does happen towards the 19th, early 19th century, towards the revolution, where the Sultan does put the kibosh and close the school because of feels the pressure that the Greeks are going to revolt, and they're going to try to form their own nation, right, and their own country. Books, go ahead.
So that is really happening in response, you know, as we sort of contextualize sort of the Greek Revolution and this larger nationalist revolutionary movements that are happening around Europe. So are you saying like the closing of the schools in some ways was a response to the Sultan, who's overseeing this kind of a target really for that kind of sentiment, sort of trying to put the kibosh on the way the winds are turning?
Yeah, and this was something that I don't think they sort of kind of understood what was going on when the revolution, they couldn't understand because you're dealing with a multi-ethnic empire. You're dealing with other multi-ethnic empires in Europe, like Austria-Hungary, right? Russia, for example, is a multi-ethnic state. So they don't understand what this sort of Greek identity is. They really don't understand what it is. I mean, obviously, the Greeks are calling themselves Romios, Rom, right? And this sort of feeling of belonging to this sort of nation, they don't quite understand it. So when it happens, it's a little bit too late for the Sultan to try to assimilate these Greeks, right? To sort of make these peoples convert them to Islam, right? There is a system of taxation that sort of pressures certain people to convert. But, you know, they close the schools, they do this, right? It's temporary, of course, because the revolution happens. Eventually, Greece gains its independence and opens its own schools later on. So yeah, it's you know, it's a way to sort of, you know, keep the sort of spread of this nationalism spreading through the nation. Not that the, you know, the revolution itself was sort of brutal, right?
Yeah, no, of course.
It is very brutal, and especially, you know, when we get towards the end of the revolution, right before the Battle of Navarino, right, when the Allies come in to help the Greeks, and you have Ibrahim Pasha coming in to retake the Peloponnese the Sultan, it's a bloodbath essentially. There's a lot of massacres going on, children being killed, people being sold into slavery, and so forth. And that's a part that we remember because it's
Yeah,
probably so traumatic, right?
of course.
Right? But most of the 400 years, we could say there's a relative peace going on in the empire, right? I don't think empires would be able to survive if there was constant conflict, right? There has to be some sort of stability going on there. So the we have we have record of what some of these books are. You know, the one book that I've come across is a teacher's manual from 1782 called Christian Teaching,
Ooh,
Didascalia Christianiki, which sort of helps shed some light of what children learned in many of the church-run schools that we're talking about during Ottoman rule. And the teachers, priests who taught these lessons, typically there were stories in these books that talked about, you know, for example, there's a young little boy named Alexandros. There's a knock on the front door. Alexandros' mother asks him to check who's knocking at the door. He notices it's a beggar. He's not quite sure if he should open the door. And the mom says to him, well, you know, you should open the door because Jesus said, if you help your fellow man, God will later reward you for
oh,
your good deeds, which is, you know, the sort of typical sort of story that a kid might learn in the Greek school at the time, right? A lot of the writings of these books were in the Koine Greek, which is, you know, the old Greek, right? And later, after the Greek Revolution, you know, we're going to have textbooks written in the Demonic Greek. So let me just shift gears, and if it's okay with you, Katie, that we
yeah,
talk a little bit about what happens after the revolution in the schools
absolutely.
and the
Yeah,
creation.
so just to kind of recap for the folks at home, we've been sort of talking about what's going on in the Greek schools during the Ottoman
Mhm.
period. And then the revolution happens, and as Professor Zervas noted, it's, you know, especially there towards the end, it kind of turns into a bloodbath. And now you have a Greek state. And I think the important thing to remember is that the Greeks as like an ethnic, as an identity, has existed for millennia, but there's no Greek state before
Right.
the Greek War of Independence. So we have a
Yeah.
Greek state now.
And I don't want to go into the nuances of this sort of the Greek idea itself. It's in some ways it's, you know, imported from outside by Greek intellectuals living in Europe, right? In places like France, for example. Uh, you have Kelaidis, for example, who is writing about and inspired by, you know, the Enlightenment ideas of Europe, right? And then leads to the sort of modern Greek Enlightenment as well. Rigas Fereos as well, who's writing about it. So in some ways, this is sort of comes through, you know, into Greece from Western Europe. The Europeans want to maintain the status quo after the Napoleonic Wars at the Treaty of Vienna, right? So they decide that status quo is important. And what happens during the Greek Revolution, it's sort of counter of what the decision was made in Vienna, right? But Metternich and Talleyrand and all these people decided maintaining the status quo. It went counter to that, right? So they're sort of challenging the political status quo, right? And then the Europeans are sort of left with a sort of decision that they have to make. Do we get involved in this? You know, Greece being a beacon of Western civilization, being the heart of Western symbolizing Western civilization for the Europeans, you know, the people that are Christians, do we end up helping them, right? So eventually Greece does become independent, right, by 1827. And then really they have to sort of make the decision of, you know, what this school is going to look like, how they're going to open these schools, and what the school is going to be used for, right? So the school serves many purposes, and even today it serves many purposes. And one, it could be for economic reasons, right? How do we use a school to sort of build our economy, right? Whether it's going to be some sort of industrial economy or today a technological economy, that sort of thing. And for purposes of Greece, it's how do we unite the people around a common national identity? And they do this through the development of their sort of curriculum, and especially their history curriculum. Konstantinos Paparigopoulos, who is known as a historian in Greece, by the 1870s, he devises a sort of plan or historical sort of timeline of Greek history. And it sort of goes from ancient, sort of medieval, which is Byzantine, to the present, right? And it's all sort of connected in one link. It's unbroken, sort of linear, and it sort of sets sort of the tone and the message out there to say to the Greek people that you are the descendants of the ancient Greeks. The Byzantine Greeks are the sort of middle point, and then there's the sort of modern Greeks, right?
Easy peasy.
Easy peasy. And the idea, of course, is, even with minority Greeks in minority peoples of Greece, there are minority groups. Sure. There's Albanian speakers, there's Vlach speakers, there are Romanian speakers, there's Slavic speakers. People that the Greek state essentially sees as they need to be re-Hellenized, meaning that they were originally Greek and now we have to make him Greek again, right? Yeah. By offering them and saying to them that you came from this great civilization, these ancient Greeks, why wouldn't you want to be, right? Okay, so that's essentially what happened. So after the revolution, the population of the country of Greece is about 1.8 million people. 98% of the population lived in rural areas. And later, we have the expansion of Greek territory, especially during the Balkan Wars, 1912 and 1913, the incorporation of northern Greece, and after World War I, even a greater expansion. So what does that mean? That means that as Greece is growing, you have more children to educate, right? And then up until 1922, with the Greek catastrophe, right, the Greco-Turkish War, you have people from Turkey, 1.5 million people from Turkey, Christians settling into Greece, and now you have to educate this large population of new arrivals into your country. What the Greek school system is modeled after, right after the revolution, it's modeled after the French Louis Guizet a school system, which sort of goes from elementary, middle school to high school, and also incorporates some of the Prussian school model, right? The Bavarian school model, which is brought in by King Otto of Greece, the first king of Greece. Textbooks, early textbooks, which is interesting, they're imported from Western Europe and they're translated into Greek, right? So these are books that kids in Western Europe are using, that Greek children will be using, and it fits beautifully. Why? Because these books are talking about ancient Greece already. It's already written for the Greeks, and the Greeks just translate and say, these are who we are, right? The ancient Greeks, they're learning the Greek mythology that the Western Europeans have already been learning, and then they just insert pages in there about maybe Byzantine Greece or about the Greek Revolution.
That's actually, I just, as you're talking, that's actually really interesting. I do a lot of, I think a lot about, sort of formation of Greek identity along the sort of reception of the classical tradition and things. And I think that's really interesting. What you're telling me is that in some ways, Western Europe took its notion of the classics, of classical Greece, right, of ancient Greece, and sort of told the Greeks who they were, and the Greeks sort of said, yes, we'll translate this into Greek for you.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting way to make a nation in some ways, right?
Yeah. See, this is a thing that you have to sort of put yourself in the context of the times and sort of, it's one thing to look at the elites that sort of understood this, which is fine, how they saw themselves, but the majority of people did not see themselves that way. And we have to remember that. So the peasant Greek, right, that has really a basic education, if they have anything, it would be very difficult for them to sort of understand that what this ancient Greece was, right? What is this distinction between sort of ancient Byzantine and modern Greek? So you have some of these textbooks saying something like Socrates embodied these Christian values, right?
Yeah.
Because Socrates predates Christianity, right? He's not a Christian, he's a pagan, right? So they'll say something, or they'll say like, Kolokotronis' sword, it was like the sword that Leonidas used at Thermopylae, right? So they make these sort of loose connections between the modern Greeks, or the Greeks of their time, and the Greeks of the ancient world. right?
Yeah.
So it's a sort of interesting sort of way that they try to connect this sort of identity to the ancient Greeks, because you have to remember the ancient Greeks, I mean, any ancient people that we look now, right? What
Yeah.
connection do we have to them? I mean, we travel in cars, we have airplanes, we have cell phones, we have, you know, high
Well,
speed
I mean,
internet.
well, I think too, like it also severs in a very, early modern European way. It actually severs the ancient tradition from the Byzantine tradition, which is certainly not how the Byzantines would have, for example, understood themselves.
They the Byzantines are interesting. They do have, and again, if you look at the elites, they do have a sense of that they are this sort of descendants of Greeks and
Yeah.
Romans. If we look at the last speech that Constantine the 11th Palaiologos does right before the fall of Constantinople, there is a line he says in there: "We are the descendants of the Greeks and Romans." He does say that. He very much sees himself as that, right? Now, who is Constantine Palaiologos? He's the emperor, right? He's
Yeah.
well educated. He's part of this elite. Would the common folk, which to me is the question, would the common folk understood that? Probably not, right? There's not this sort of connection to that sort of past maybe as well, and we see that even later, even at the for the historical sites, like, you know, there's not most peasant rural Greeks are not going to sort of connect it. They'll connect to their town, villages, families, church, and so forth, but it'll be very, very difficult for them to understand what it means to be ancient, part of this sort of descendants of the ancient Greeks.
Well, I think, and this is a question I think to queue up for a later question. I definitely have for you, but in terms of having lived in the Ottoman Empire, your primary identity would be, I imagine, religious,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely,
Like you
yeah,
would primarily think of yourself in terms of religion. Certainly, the exchange of population
sure,
happens that way. Um, so, and that isn't connected. I mean, you can kind of, Socrates was a good Christian or whatever, but
right.
in reality, that really isn't connected to the ancient world in a, you know, in a obvious way. Obviously, there's these connections with Roman mystery cults and things. So,
Right, and there were Europeans who challenged this notion, like Fallmeyer, who said, the Tyrolean Fallmeyer, who said that, you know, there's really no ancient Greeks left, and really in the modern Greeks, that, you know, most of these people are really, you know, uh, the population was replaced by Slavic migrations and Albanian migration, which is not true, right?
yeah,
You know, they're
I have
the
the
point is,
mitochondrial DNA to prove it.
yeah, if you do a DNA test from, you know, 23andMe, yeah,
Yeah.
it'll show, right, it'll show, you know, whether or
Yeah.
not you're Greek or not. Now so the point is how much, for me, I don't look at like, for me, I look at culture. To me is
Yeah.
important, how much, and I think culture is what's important here, right? How much of that
Absolutely.
sort of culture is still there. The language is still there, right?
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
that's
That's
what the
the
Greek,
Chinese.
yeah, and that's what the Greek state sees when they create this Greek state. They say, well, we still have the language. There are people still speaking Greek. The religion, Orthodoxy, Christianity, goes back to the Byzantine Greeks. And in some ways, you can make the sort of argument, right, depending on who is in the room, that even Greek Orthodox Christianity, you know, is influenced by still these sort of pagan traditions, right?
Yeah.
So,
It's the Hellenism. I mean, orthodoxy really is. I mean, I would argue. I'm willing to kind of say that. Like, I think what makes Christianity, post Constantinian Christianity, become Christianity is the fusion of this sort of Jewish messianic cult with Hellenism. You
right,
know.
exactly, right. And we know that with, and I don't want to go into the
Yeah.
early church father, but yeah, it's what exactly what you said. And then the other third part is a sort of geography, right? So you're occupying the same territory that the ancient Greeks occupied, right? And that your ancestors occupied, right?
Yeah.
So you're still living in this territory. So that's the idea. There is, you have those three elements, right? The
Yeah.
language, you have the religion, right? And then you have, and the religious part is a little bit harder to defend, but it's still there. You can still make the argument there, right? And then you have the geography. We occupy the land that these people in ancient times still occupied, right? The national project of Greece, unlike other countries, right, it doesn't look towards its folk sort of pre-existing folk traditions that sort of define who they are, like in Germany, for example,
Yeah.
and much of sort of Central Europe, where they sort of go around and sort of find, and the Greeks do this too later with politis, find local stories and make this part of the sort of national, um, put it into the literature of the nation and sort of unite the people around, or build monuments like the Cologne Cathedral, statues of Otto von Bismarck, to unite the people around that. What the Greeks, on the other hand, do is they invest heavily on antiquities and on archaeology, right? Um, and Hamilakis has a great book, The Nation and Its Ruin, that talks about just that. Like, you know, we don't have to create these monuments. All we have to do is sort of dig and we'll find them there.
Yeah.
That's how we prove that this is who we are, right? So it's a really, really fascinating how it happens. And then, let me just talk a little bit about,
Yeah.
unless you have a quick question, Katie.
No, I'm
And
fine. No, please go
I'll be
ahead.
happy to answer any of your questions. And I have some figures here. 1830, there were 71 elementary schools in Greece with about 6,000 pupils. A decade later, there were 252 elementary schools with 22,000 students and 10,000 teachers. We also have a nationalized school system that happens in Greece that sort of follows a model of what's happening in most of Europe. And the national system basically says that, you know, all schools are going to look like this. This is what they're going to teach, and that sort of gets to sort of more developing the sort of Greek identity through education. If we learn the same stories and we have the same experience as schools, it's going to automatically unite us, right, later on, right?
Yeah.
So a kid up in northern Greece is learning the same thing as a kid in the Peloponnese, reading through the same textbook. That's going to sort of form some bonds with each other, right, if they came across each other, right? And it's also the idea of common bloodlines, that all Greeks are, you know, what we talked about earlier, they're all descendant of the ancient Greeks and they share common blood as well, which becomes a sort of theme. And then knowing about the nation, patriognosis it's called, right? Knowing about the patrida, right? And it centers around the history curriculum, the literature curriculum, and then around geography. The geography curriculum is very interesting to me because it sort of goes through and says, this is what all Greek towns look like. They have a church, and these are some of the occupation of people that they do in these towns, right? So there's a priest and there's a farmer, you know, for little kids. And then there's the alphabetarium, the alphabet, where, you know, basic reading and writing. And this is not different from what's going on in the rest of the world. Even here in the United States, you have, you know, the primer, the book that children are learning how to read. Often they read passages from the Bible. The same thing is sort of happening in Greece as well. It's not until later that the Greek history textbook, after Constantine Papadopoulos that I talked about in 1871, the Greek textbooks are going to be exclusively written by Greeks. Typically how this is done is there's a competition, and usually people submit the textbook that they write to the Ministry of Education, and people review them, and then they decide which textbooks they're going to use, and depending on what grade level in the schools. There's very little change in Greek textbooks even today. They happen every maybe 30 years, if any change. And it's very controversial in Greece if changes are made to the textbook, if they're being revised to sort of slanted a little bit differently. 2007, there was an attempt to do this, and it was undermined later. They said that they would, because it was just too political of an issue. Some of the things that they talk about in the textbooks, especially the Greek textbooks, and following the sort of Konstantinos Papadopoulos historical model, one continuous unbroken Greek history from past to present. You know, when we look at the Ottoman Empire, it's generally presented as a period of slavery of 400 years under Turkish occupation. The Greek Revolution discusses the heroes of the revolution, such as Rigas Fereos, Korais, Kolokotronis, Miaoulis, Makrianis, Diakos, Bubulina, Androutos. Mention is made of the Klefs and the Armatoli, right, which are the sort of bandits during the Greek Revolution, the massacre in Chios, as well as the dance of Zalogo up in Suli, where, if you were in Greek school, you know, the women sort of throw their babies off the cliff, and then they too jump rather than being slaves to the Turks. Overall, Greek history is presented as one continuous history from past to present, and viewed as something that could generate sort of patriotism and loyalty to the nation. What they learn in their literature class, right? Let's say in elementary school, after they learn how to read, they read the stories of Aesop, some folk songs, some riddles. They'll do some sort of Greek mythology as well. So you also have, after the revolution, the opening of teacher training school to train teachers to educate these children across the country. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was
No,
almost joking.
I think that's pretty much a nutshell of.
Can I actually? So if you're satisfied, I actually have some questions, and
Sure.
I'm mindful of your time as well.
Yeah.
But I have some questions about Greek schools in the diaspora.
Sure.
And the ways the Greek diaspora plays into the creation of Greek identity, how Greek school functions in the diaspora. I'm basically asking you, did my mother waste every Wednesday of my youth? Is what I'm asking.
I went to all-day Greek school, so I didn't.
Oh.
Wednesday for me. It was all day for me. So you have all-day Greek school, you have the night school, and then you have the Saturday schools. And then most cities, and the Greek schools, and the expert in this is my friend Fevronia Soumakis, who's out in New York City, and she writes about this, and she's written a wonderful dissertation on this, and we've written an edited volume together on Greek American education. But the Greek schools in the United States, again, they come. It's sort of it goes along with what's happening in Greece. How the first Greek schools are open, where they sort of come out of the church, right? So there's a church, and then there's a school, and that's how it happens here too, right? And if you know. The Greek education today is under the Ministry of Education. There's no separation of church and state in Greece, right?
Yeah. No.
So, which is sort of right now we have, because it's a homogenous country, but now with the immigrant groups coming in, this sort of creates some antagonisms. But anyway, so here in the United States, it's similar to that. The Greek schools are created, right, to educate this Greek population, the children of these Greek immigrants here. The Greeks, at least in the diaspora, from what I've seen, they've been very, very successful in creating independent schools to educate Greek American population, a Greek Canadian population, or so forth. And they're similar in Canada, in the United States, and in Australia. They're not that different. They sort of follow the same sort of model. What other immigrant groups do, which is interesting, they try to use the public school system to teach their language, where the Greeks sort of say, no, we're going to do open our own schools to this. And that's part of their resistance to assimilate. They don't want to be assimilated. Where you see with Italian groups, for example, there's more of a willingness to sort of assimilate. With Irish groups, again, there's more of a willingness to sort of assimilate than, let's say, the Greek immigrant groups, who still want to maintain their language. They fear this sort of assimilation. And I think that partly because of what their experience was during Ottoman colonial rule.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I think you just answered a question I've had for well over a decade. If you look at the school foreign language offerings in places like New York, where you have large Greek communities, you'll see Italian, you'll see Polish, for example, on the school curriculums, but you won't see modern Greek, even in areas like Astoria, where there's large numbers of Greek. The language teaching is still happening sort of in these independent schools. Thank you. That actually answered a question I had.
Yeah. And then, but also remember, there was more of a longing for the Greeks to go back to Greece. There was this longing to maybe there was a possibility that we would go. A lot of people think that when the Greek immigrants came here, they sort of left Greece and weren't interested in coming back. I mean, I have two great grandparents that were in Chicago in the 1920s, right?
Yeah.
Settled in Chicago, worked for about 5-6 years, then went back to Greece.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
and decided to spend the rest of their lives back to Greece, right? After they made a little bit of money here. 1950s, after 1950, the immigrants that came in, half of them ended up going back to Greece, which is an interesting statistic because you know, a lot of people, we have this notion that people come to America and they sort of say, oh, we're going to stay here forever. It's great here. When in reality, no, there is this sort of longing by Greek immigrants to go back to Greece. You don't find that so much with other immigrant groups, like with, you know, German immigrant groups, Italian, you know, they sort of cast away their German identities or Italian identity, and they say, we're going to stay here, right? We're going to become American. With the Greeks, it's a little bit different, right? So I think the Greek schools serve, one, to maintain that, a sort of, in the United States, maintain that identity, but also prepare the Greek child to go to school in Greece if so happen the families decide to move back to Greece for whatever reason it was. And that does happen. I remember in Greek school, we had kids that moved back to Greece. It happened all the time, right?
Yeah.
The family decided we're going to move back to Greece and we're going to live there. So I think also to remember with, you know, with immigrant groups living in countries that they might be the minority, right? That they feel more tied to their sort of cultural identities because they feel more threatened that they might lose it, right? So
Absolutely.
with Greek immigrant groups in the United States, right? They tend to be more religious than, let's say, Greeks in Greece, right? Because they're just feeling that they might lose their religious traditions or their faith. Where in Greece, it's all around you, right?
You couldn't lose it if you wanted to. Yeah.
Exactly, right. So that's exactly, or they might lose their language, right? Or you know, so some of that is happening here in the United States. It's a robust system, the Greek education. It's modeled after, later it's going to be modeled more and more after the sort of Catholic school system, with organizations and like youth groups, you know, like Goya, kids, you know, having basketball teams and churches playing against each other, that sort of thing. So the problem, of course, now is that, you know, slowly the Greek schools are disappearing, right?
Yeah.
And you know, there's still the Saturday schools and the night schools during the weekends. I don't know if there's not many fully day schools during the day. So
No, that's really interesting. No, I think this is so interesting. I really am interested in how education sort of shapes sort of nation, you know, how people manipulate education, manipulate not in a judgmental way in the comments, but manipulate education to sort of shape identity. Thank you so much, Professor Zervas.
Sure.
This was absolutely fascinating and absolutely wonderful. And I thank you very much. And all of you, we're going to have links in the bio. We'll put a link in the bio to your books if people are interested.
Great.
And thank you again. And we'll see you tomorrow for our next bicentennial video. Goodbye.